Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Good morning, everybody. It's my great pleasure to introduce Mina. How do you pronounce your name? Sorry. Guris. Mina Guris. Mina Guris is a PhD candidate from Boston University, and he's interviewing for research SDE position with the Distributed System Security Group.
Thank you.
He will be talking about adaptation equals to vulnerability under RoQ attacks.
Thanks, Helen. Thanks all for coming here. It's a pleasure to be here, of course. So what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to show you that the adaptation mechanisms that we currently employ in our computing systems and in our networks are actually vulnerable. And I'm going to show this new class of attack that I call RoQ Attacks, or reduction of quality attacks, that target these adaptation mechanisms. So I'm going to start with some background first and then introduce RoQ Attacks more formally. So if you have any questions, feel free to interrupt me at any time. So all of you know what a denial of service attack is. So the goal is to make a resource unavailable for legitimate use. And how it's easy, you subject this resource to a load that exceeds the capacity. So if your DOS attack targets the system, it's going to try to make it in an overload situation all the time. So for example, you have this bridge, you want to deny cars for crossing the bridge, then you bring these big elephants and let them stand on the bridge. And all of you know that denial of service attacks are a big deal. They can disrupt critical network services, they affect companies, government agencies, universities. Attacks could be very sustained, they can last for a long time. And it costs a lot of money just to prevent these attacks, or even when they happen, it costs a lot of money to prevent them. And you always hear about this 13-year-old kid who can bring down an enterprise just by launching an attack. So what are the characteristics of DOS attack? Well, first of all, it takes a lot of effort to mount a DOS attack. Why? Because you need to find these elephants, or the zombies that you're going to use, and at the same time you need to direct them somehow and control them to direct their traffic towards the server. Another characteristic is that it's very easy to know that the system is under attack. Once the DOS attack is launched, you know that the system is not reacting, is not behaving correctly. And you could use anomaly detection mechanisms to infer that this is an under attack. And in theory, you can trace back the guys who prepared the attack. So recently, there has been new classes of denial of service attacks that does not require this flood of requests to this web server, for example. For example, there is the RoQ attacks that was introduced in CCOM 2003, and they target specific protocol settings, for example, the TCP timeout. I'm going to talk about this later during my talk. There's also a new class of algorithmic complexity attacks that target data structure that we use in our applications. So for example, if you have a hashing table and you know that it takes order 1 to insert an element, if the attacker can generate requests that all hash in the same bin, then insertion will take order n. And if the application is busy doing these insertions, then legitimate user will be denied access. So I'm going to talk about today is part of my thesis, which is about, I'm going to show you that actually we can bring a resource down to its knees with only few number of machines, number of zombies, and without the risk of being detected. The attacks will not be detected. And if the attacks will not be detected, it's very hard to trace back to the guys who prepared the attack. How we're going to do this? We're going to exploit the built-in adaptation mechanisms to make the system in a transient state all the time. So the idea here is that we're going to make the system switch between overload and underload all the time, prevent the system from converging, basically. So if you think about driving, we can exploit the drivers by making drivers slow down when they should accelerate and accelerate when they should slow down. So to give you an example, on a highway, this would resemble a DOS attack. It's like a gridlock. You're targeting the capacity overload all the time. What I'm going to talk about is adaptation, exploiting adaptation, where we're going to cause cars to be to have these pockets where there'll be congestion in some parts, and some parts the highway will be underutilized. And of course, harm is in both ways, because here you're underutilizing the highway, and here legitimate user will have extra time because of congestion. Probably you've seen something like this on a highway. Maybe there's an accident on the other side and people are looking and slowing down. So these are exploiting the adaptation. So RoQ Attacks stands for reduction of quality, and it's pronounced as RoQ. And it targets adaptation mechanisms that we employ in our computing systems and networks. And RoQ Attacks does not necessarily result in a complete denial of service attack, because that's easy to be exposed. So what we're going to look at is a significant loss of performance or quality. And whenever there's adaptation, RoQ Attacks could make this adaptation harmful. So the question is, why do RoQ Attacks target adaptation? Because when we design the systems, we never think about adaptation as being exploited by an attacker. For example, we do some stress testing, we analyze our systems under bursty traffic. But there's a big difference between doing this and the presence of an attacker inside the system whose main goal is to exploit these mechanisms. For example, we should have the mindset of what cryptographers do. In cryptography, people model Alice, Bob, and they model Eve as well, where Eve is trying to disrupt communication or break down the protocols. So in system, we don't have this notion of Eve inside the system. Moreover, in cryptography, they give Eve some powers, like an oracle power. So we should have this mindset when we design our system, same as cryptographers do. So the research question that I'm going to talk about today is what types or patterns of load can make adaptation harmful, and what are the trade-offs between being resilient to RoQ attacks and being vulnerable to these exploits. So I developed a general adaptation framework that enables us to study these dynamic exploits, and I'm going to instantiate this framework on different systems. For example, congestion control, admission control, load balancers, content adaptation. And the methodology that I use is first that I develop a dynamic model to model basically the interplay between the system components, and I do some numerical solutions, and then of course these models usually abstract some details that I have to do some simulation where I introduce these details, and then I test these attacks on real systems to see how they behave. So I'm going to start with the general adaptation framework, and then I'm going to instantiate this on 3 different systems. I'm going to focus more on the server admission control and the network transport protocols. And I'm just going to give an example of how can these exploits happen on server load balancers. And then I'll end up with some summary and future work. So we're going to think of adaptation as there's 2 players. There's a resource and there's some consumers for these resources. A resource will observe some load and then will set a price. And the consumers in return will observe this price and set their demand. So price could be anything, but we're going to think of price as, we can think of price as real hard cash, something that hurts you to pay. For example, now there's a sudden increase in the gas prices because the demand is higher. You know, it's summer, people are starting to drive, so demand is higher than load, so the prices has to increase. But for the purpose of this talk, I'm going to focus on price as a congestion measure. For example, admission ratio, response time, something that would hurt you. Packet loss, for example, would be a price. So this is a general block diagram explaining the picture what I had before. You have some consumers, they observe their price, they set their demand, and the resource has something called the pricing function. It basically, for every load, it tells you what price should it use. And this price is fed back to the consumers. And the goal of this is to bring the price to a stable point where everybody's happy. That's the main goal of the adaptation. Yes?
Question about this model.
Sure.
In real systems, like here I'm thinking of like, you know, sites on the internet or something, you know, clients or people can access the site. Do the consumers adjust their demand in response to the observed price? What does that correspond to?
So for example, for TCP, yes. For example, for web server, the consumer will send requests, but whoever is admitted is going. You can think of these as the consumers.
Right.
So the number of them is a function of the price, which is the admission ratio, for example. So if I say 80% of...
So the way in which the consumers adjust their demand is actually just sort of a result of
observing the price.
Of the admission control?
Yes, for this particular... So this is very general. I'm going to instantiate it later on these systems.
You're saying for TCP, less people in, that's less demand. It's not something that the clients do voluntarily, but it's something...
For TCP, the clients do that. They observe packet loss, they slow down.
Okay.
Right?
But for admission control on a web server, you're actually involving the actual person in that, so he doesn't get to the website, so he gives up, or...
Yeah, he gives up, yeah.
Or the demand continues because the user just sits there.
No, I don't consider this. I don't consider this case. Yeah.
Actually, Amazon Search uses similar thing. When the load is very, very huge, what they do, they put all requests in a queue, and they intentionally delay some responses, so the consumer waits for additional half a second, but that helps us to make everybody happy.
Right.
That sounds perfectly reasonable. It just doesn't sound to me like the consumer choosing to adjust his consumption rate as a function of what he observes.
Their browser uses.
Yeah. He's a consumer. It just sort of sounds
Or if you can think of consumers as in classes, for example, then you could have this case where a bunch of consumers react in some way together. So if there's a decrease, then all of them observe it. Yeah, it will become more clear once I go to the detailed model. Okay, so the goal of this system is to converge. So you want to bring this system into steady state. So resources will iterate over the load, and consumers will iterate over the prices. So if you start with a particular load with a particular price that's high, you start decreasing the price. And if you have the right functions, then convergence to this optimal point will happen. And this can be proved by nonlinear control theory like Lyapunov functions, which is basically the idea is that you show that there's a scalar value or there's a distance that is always being minimized until it reaches this point. As long as it is continuously decreasing, then you can guarantee that you reach this point. So RoQ Attacks will try to prevent this convergence. So this is the curves on the x-axis load, again on the y-axis the price. And once you start converging, the attacker, if he can push the capacity of the system somehow, then the prices will be very high. And if he can do this in points in time, then you will never converge to this operating point. So in effect, RoQ Attacks will destroy this contractive mapping for these functions that is essential for this convergence. So how the attacker can do this? So we're going to use a square wave. So the attacker would send requests or packets for a very short time called tau with some rate, and then we'll sleep for a while, and then we'll repeat the same thing again. And the values of delta, tau, and t will be changed depending on the settings that we're going to consider. So the denial of service attack, when we think of DOS attacks, we always think of damage that has been inflicted. So I introduced this new notion of potency, which is basically the damage divided by the cost. So this is actually the marginal utility of the attack traffic. The attacker goal is to maximize the damage, cause the maximum damage with the minimum amount of cost. And for different instantiations, we're going to be looking at different matrices for this. For example, damage could be number of rejected requests, legitimate rejected requests, response time, increase in response time, wasted bandwidth. In the same time, the cost also is injected requests, number of attackers, number of machines used. We also model the aggressiveness of the attack by this parameter omega. So omega, when we have a large omega, this means that this is the highest level of aggression, like a DOS attack. Smaller omega means that the attacker wants to keep a low profile. So it's very careful in using the cost. This enables us to study different classes of exploits. Okay, so I'm going to start with the server admission control. So admission control, basically you have some client generating some requests. The admission controller decides the price or the admission ratio, and the web server decides which request will be admitted to the web server and which request will be rejected. And the web server will feed back its utilization back to the admission controller. And the admission controller would then readjust the price. And typically the web server, typically they have like some target utilization. So you want to say operate at 80%, because beyond that your users will experience longer delays or something like this. So they have also a target utilization, which the admission controller is trying to match it to the current utilization. So this is the instantiation. So you have some target utilization, and you have some measured utilization. And based on the difference, you compute an error signal. This error signal is used for the controller to adjust the admission ratio. The admission ratio will decide which requests will be sent to the web servers, which will be rejected. And the web server there's a monitor that monitors the utilization of the web server and reports this back to the admission controller. So I'm going to talk about these different pieces now. So the admission controller decides what percentage of requests should be admitted, and we used a PI controller, proportional integral controller. So alpha of t at time t, that's the admission ratio at time t, is equal to some k, times the error signal. This is how far you are from your target, plus what the error issue was there before. And alpha of t should always be between 0 and 1. Of course, if rho of t is equal to rho, then alpha of t is equal to alpha of t minus 1, and basically you are converged already to the stable point. And of course, k here plays a very important parameter, because when k is large, this means that this controller will react very aggressively. But when k is small, the controller will react in a smooth way, because the error signal is multiplied by a small number. The feedback monitor will measure the server utilization and reports this back to the admission controller. And there could be some feedback delay, and this is inherent in any system, because your admission controller might be on a different machine, for example, than the real web server. So we modeled the server using these two functions. So what I'm showing here on the x-axis is number of requests inside the system. They drive the utilization. For example, when you don't have any requests, there is some background utilization due to some background processes, for example. And you want to operate at some point here. This is your target utilization. What I'm showing here on the x-axis is utilization, on the y-axis I'm showing the service rate. And there is a point where if you increase your utilization, your service rate actually will go down. This is due to thrashing, for example, or the system is operating in a very heavy situation. So paging, for example, and stuff like this. So we approximate these functions with two piecewise linear functions. And we call the slope here is a thrashing index. This is how bad the system behaves when it's thrashing. So what's the RoQ attack? So the attacker will send a lot of requests in a very short time. That's enough to push the server into the thrashing. And then it will stop. And the admission controller, of course, will start denying access to legitimate users until the system recovers. But recovery will take a long time, because now the system is thrashing and the service rate is minimized. And then once the system recovers, the attacker will do this again. So this is the numerical results. So what I'm showing here on the x-axis is time. On the y-axis, I'm showing the admission ratio and the utilization. So, and the attack is launched at time 150. So before that, the admission ratio was around 0.9. The utilization was about 0.75. And you can see here, this is the effect of the attack. Here I'm just zooming into one of these attack bursts. So at this time, a lot of requests come in, enough to push the server into high utilization due to thrashing. So utilization will remain at 1. During this time, the admission controller closes its gate to legitimate users, and then it opens the gate again. So the question is, how many requests did we deny over this period? How many legitimate requests did we deny over this period? Divided by how much did the attacker really send during this period? This is what we call the potency. Yes?
So this assumes that, as you described, that the design of the admission gate is such that it would let through enough requests to push the backend system into the thrashing system.
Right, because this is a percentage.
Right. That sort of seems like a poor design. I don't know what production systems look like, but it seems like I'd be tempted to make the admission controller have some knowledge of like the absolute ceiling of requests that should ever let through, and just clamp at that point without any feedback from the backend.
Yeah, they don't use that because they cannot tell. So typically these requests could be very different. Some of them are very short, some of them are very long.
So there isn't a predefinable ceiling.
Unless you want to underutilize the system, because you might have a lot of very small requests. Okay. So you could be handling more, but since you put this threshold, you will be underutilizing the system.
Okay, so you're saying in practice there's no easy way for the for the admission gate to know a good ceiling to hit.
Unless the system is very defined and you know how long you're going to take. And
okay, so it can't tell when it lets through.
Yeah,
how much load it'll cause on the back end.
Right.
So it's realistic that it might let through enough to thrash the system.
Right. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
So it also seems that it seems to me like the problem though of not thrashing was already thought about quite hard in a like a non-adversarial setting by like the CEDA work, the SCBA work, where they talked about how would we design a web server that would degrade gracefully under you know, that seems like a good approach to kind of deal with this at the scheduling policy of the backend.
And then what did it start discarding requests at the web server, or did it throttle itself somehow, or where did it?
It had pushback from various queues within the web server around loops and around resources.
And would it push back to like an admission gate like this, or?
Yes, but it was just at the beginning of the web server. It would basically drop at entrance whenever it was, you know, it would say I can't have more than 3 of X at any given event stage in my system.
And then it would just start dropping.
Yes. Yes.
So that's almost like an admission gate with no
It's like an
delay.
admission gate with no thrashing.
Right, but
Or critically with no delay. Right? Suppose you modeled it here, right? You just
It has some delay, but because it's all, but it was on a single machine. I don't know how much delay it had.
yeah,
I
but
don't
see,
know what
this could be the
it
point of the attacker, because the attacker might be interested in actually causing these delay.
Right.
So now I can change the attack parameters just to cause the maximum delay without being rejection.
So
So
the delay seems critical because the design is that somehow the system, the web server itself, never takes on so much work that it would start to thrash. Then it seems as though the delay is zero. Right? You can't peak flood it suddenly, with enough requests to fool it into taking on enough work to start thrashing. Anyway, okay.
All right. So the damage is the additional number of legitimate requests that we rejected over this period of time, and the cost is the number of attack requests that we sent. So in the paper we drive closed formulas, so you can plug in these formulas and find the numbers, and we can achieve a potency of 100. So this means that for every request the attacker sends, 100 legitimate requests will be denied access. Yeah.
So does that number 100 depend on particular parameter?
Right. Yes, I will talk about this. Yeah, it depends very much on parameters of choice. So yeah, so what's the trade-off? So here I'm showing. Remember the k parameter that was in the PI controller. So I'm showing here different values of k versus different potencies. So you can think of potency as vulnerability, k as stability. Why? Because when k is small, the system is very stable. It doesn't react in an aggressive way. When k is large, the system reacts very aggressively. What I'm showing here is that actually the choice of k small for stability actually hurts the security, because now the system is very vulnerable, potency of 100. So it's very important to highlight this, because we usually do some tweaks and we do a lot of work just to optimize this space, but actually this space is actually very vulnerable for under RoQ attacks.
It seems like there must be a drawback to having k be large, other than
Oh yeah, so when k is large, if you think about system without attacks now, it's going to be very all over the place, because now it's
So it decreases overall utilization, even if it.
Is that the
Is that it?
damage?
It decreases. Large K decreases overall
Right.
utilization.
If for example,
adversarial setting?
yes, because you're going to be very bursty, so you might deny requests that you can just handle them.
Okay.
Yeah. So I did some implementation. We had the server. We have a bunch of clients. The server is running mini HTTPD, and we use the PI controller on the server. And for every request the client sends, the server is going to fork a thread. This thread will access 1 megabytes of memory, and it takes on average 20 milliseconds. And we measure the utilization as used memory divided by total memory on the server. This is what is reported back to the admission controller. And the clients use HTTP-perf to generate requests. So this is the implementation results we have. Again, I'm showing on the x-axis here is time. On y-axis,
What was the desired utilization?
it was 100%.
Okay.
We're admitting everybody.
Okay.
Sorry, the utilization was 0.1. Sorry.
The desired utilization.
Yeah.
is 0.1.
Yeah.
The target?
The target. Yeah.
The admission controller tried to maintain.
Right. 0.1.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. So you can see here the attack started, the utilization jumps to 1. Consequently, the admission controller would decrease it closes its gate, and then it opens again once the attack ceases. Again, I'm showing here.
It seems like the admission falloff is very steep.
Sorry?
Sorry.
So
Go ahead.
Something the emission ratio already at 0.2.
Here? The admission ratio in red?
Yeah,
Yeah,
because it
so-
starts going back up again.
Right.
Where the utilization is still above 0.1. Why did it do that? If it's targeting 0.1?
Sorry.
So at that very point that you're pointing
Here, yeah.
that shows the admission ratio going back up again?
Right, yeah.
Even though the utilization is above the target?
Are you sure the target was 0.1?
The utilization is above the target?
Yes.
Isn't utilization above the target then?
Yes, yeah. Utilization is above the target.
So why did it open the...
Yeah, so why is the admission ratio back up?
I remember. The utilization is not instant utilization. That's why you can see there is, it was using some average. You can see that the utilization was very bursty, so you couldn't really get a signal that you can use. So I think there was averaging here.
People typically average over the path, though, which would push it even further of being higher than the target.
Yeah.
Unless what you've recorded is not.
Sorry?
I mean, if what you're recording here on your graph is just not what was going into the feedback controller.
No, this was what was actually going back in the feedback controller. Yeah.
This makes it look as though maybe target utilization was like 0.5.
I can check and get back to you. I can't remember exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, let's take this offline. I'll check and tell you. So.
And I think the other thing that I was wondering about, which is a little different, is I'm not sure what causes this, but in that first section where the admission ratio starts dropping, I feel like I would have expected to see the utilization sort of drop off more progressively. It sort of falls off a cliff in a certain point. This is probably just sort of some detail of how the experiment happens to work. I would have expected to see the utilization roll off, right? Whereas here, you drop the admission ratio, you're turning people away, and then for some reason, bam, it suddenly has an effect, right? The utilization falls to the floor.
Is that a function of the K value?
Yeah, because it drops off because you got rid of all the requests that were inside.
Oh, I see. So here we're at maximum utilization.
Right.
We're still
Yeah.
chewing through the back.
Right.
And then
Exactly. You're done with them.
Done. We're done.
Yeah. Because now the input to the system is very low because of the admission ratio 0.4.
I see. Okay, that doesn't make sense.
Yeah. So here I'm showing again the effect of K and the effect of potency. Again, you see the same trend. But you can see here that we got potency of 9 or 8, which is very different from the 100 we got in the model. So the client rates, actually, we're using 12 requests per second. And actually, the attacker's rate is actually 1.2 requests per second on average. So basically, it's hard to distinguish the attack traffic if you're looking at average over longer time scales.
So actually, I have one more question.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
I don't remember you telling us anything about the queue depth here.
The queue depth?
Yeah, I mean, where does that come from? It must matter. Right, 'cause the admission controller, is there any queue past the admission controller on the other side of it?
Oops.
Don't worry about that.
Oh, it's on the laptop.
I was figuring it was hard, but I figured it was hard, but then I was like, you need tissues?
I got some. Okay, sorry. So we're thinking about the queue. So there is the queue, of course, that on the network card, right? How many requests can be admitted, right? So I didn't try to change these values and look at what difference.
I just don't know what they are either.
Yeah.
Right, so it's just more a question of interest.
Again, I can't remember the details exactly. But again, as long as the attacker can keep the queue full all the time, regardless of the size, then there's always going to be load on the system for the admission controller to behave this way. Do you agree with that?
Yes. I was just curious as to what kind of additional delay that introduced, because you talked about how additional delay makes the feedback controller take longer to stabilize.
Right. Yeah. I haven't looked at this.
Okay.
Yeah.
If you have a deep enough queue, that's going to limit the burstiness effect, right?
That's right. Yeah.
The client has to supply its huge transient load for longer.
Yeah.
To fill the queue.
Which might make it more noticeable.
But it doesn't have to fill the queue, right? It just has to push the backend system into thrashing.
Right.
It just has to be the case that as the attack requests get pulled off the queue and processed, that's somehow intense enough to push the system into thrashing.
That's right. Yeah.
There doesn't have to be a whole queue full of them.
Because basically you're forking a thread for every request that you get. So what's the impact of feedback delay? So again, the feedback delay is the time it takes to measure utilization and report back to the admission controller. And this could be real delay or due to averaging. And so what I'm showing here on the x-axis is the delay. We increase the delay. and on the y-axis we increase the potency. So we can achieve potency around 18 or 19. So there is a big difference between the implementation part and the model where we got 100. And the reason is that Linux tried to get out of thrashing by killing threads, and sometimes it kills the thread that we are using to measure these. So effectively we get higher throughput because once Linux starts killing threads, it's a really bad situation. But we couldn't measure them. Sorry?
Is this a kernel feature?
Yeah.
It starts killing kernel threads? This isn't
No, kernel
feature
threads.
like
No, application threads.
application.
Yeah.
So this is a feature of the usual thread package?
Yeah, this is how, yeah, exactly. Okay, so I'm going to look at RoQ exploits on load balancers. So the idea here, of course, you don't have one server, you have multiple servers, and you have load balancers and the same setup. And the load balancer decides the admission ratio for each one of them. And each server would report back its load to the load balancers, and the load balancer would adjust the load on each server accordingly. So I'm going to show you actually exploits instead of going through the model and everything like I did before. I'm going to show you RoQ exploits on George Washington Bridge. So I drive to New York a lot, and I'm usually concerned about driving to New York because I'm worried about delay on George Washington Bridge. So
Sorry, here's a naive question.
Yeah.
Do load balancers on large production systems actually take the next state, the next level of machines load into account, or do they just do something naive for really fast bandwidth?
Sorry?
Like round robin?
Could you repeat your question?
The front-end load balancers in large production systems, do they actually work in this way? Do they monitor the load on each of the individual machines in the next level? Or do they do something naive for speed?
All of them. So sometimes do round robin. Sometimes there's you can like do in the DNS, for example, they put the whole servers in the DNS.
Right.
Sometimes they do. You measure the feed. You measure some load and you report back to the load balancers to adjust it.
Okay, so as far as you know, some large-scale production systems actually do this.
And actually, this part is it's proposed in many work. You use these adaptation mechanisms.
Yeah, this was a naive question. I wasn't sure if maybe on a large farm you just go for the naive approach because you can get more bandwidth. Right? Like I don't want to hear about the load.
Right. You just
round robin
or add more machines, and
you
don't have this problem at all.
Anyway.
Right. Yeah. So George Washington Bridge, there's two levels, upper level, lower level, and there is delay signs before you reach the bridge. And the driver's adaptation is to observe the delay signs and typically choose the one that is shorter. And we're going to think of the adversary now as he owns some cars. So you're driving to New York, and there's upper level, lower level, and the adversary will have red cars and legitimate cars are in black. So the delay on the upper level is 10 minutes, on the lower level is 12 minutes. They're pretty close, so you can say that 50% will go there, 50% will go the other way because nobody will choose the 10 because they think everybody's going to choose the 10, so I better choose the 12. So imagine at some point in time, a burst comes to the upper level. So what's going to happen is that legitimate users, since this didn't reflect yet on the delay signs, will still go 50% will go up, 50% will go down on the lower level. And at some point in time, the effect of this burst will register at the upper level. Now all requests observing these differences will go to the lower level. But the lower level was not designed in the first place to handle all the requests from all the users. And once the system recovers, the attacker repeats the same thing. So what's the damage here? The damage would be the additional delay for legitimate drivers, and the cost of the attack, for example, would be gas. How much you're paying for gas. Yeah.
You left that imperfect. Like the attacker at some point starts the attack on the upper level, but until the congestion clearance is reflected on the display, nobody goes to the upper level, which is wasted time.
Right. Yeah. Well, it depends. It will depend on the parameters later. But yeah, for this set.
First occurs to the upper level. The first damage is that people pile up behind.
Exactly.
Cars,
yes.
Right? But then there's another wave of damage, right, where
underutilization of the first one.
Clear off all the attacking cars, and still nobody goes to the upper level.
Everybody's going down. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So this is example for a least loaded policy because a driver would choose the least loaded. So also there is proportional control balancer. So if in a simple setting you have two servers, and each server has some queue, and you have the same equation, almost the same. The admission ratio for server 2 is some k times the difference between the queue sizes. So the load balancer here is trying to match these two queue sizes. And I'm showing here on the x-axis time, on the y-axis I'm showing the queue size. Attacks happen on one of the servers, and then you see this hump on the other server, and then they stabilize, and then the attack repeats again. So So the question is, how would we defend against these exploits? So since these exploits target adaptation mechanisms, so let's remove adaptation altogether. Well, of course, we don't have any thrashing in this case, but again, we're underutilizing the system. This is what you pointed out, having a maximum threshold on the number of requests, for example, the server can handle. We can use randomization. So the idea here is that if the attacker, if the system is randomizing its adaptation or randomizing its adaptation parameters, then it's gonna be harder for the attacker to figure out what's really happening. But again, it does not remove completely the effect of the attack, and also the attacker could be randomized. There is smoothing, so this is like buffering the request and then delay them over time. So basically, this burst get dispersed over time. But the problem, of course, is that so this would remove the effect of the attack, but again, legitimate user will experience longer delays. And for some applications, this may not be tolerated. Can also detect these square wave, for example, using detection mechanisms, but it's very complex to figure out how to distinguish between them so you can prevent these attacks. There's also some work which I did on multi-level control. So the idea here is that we're going to adjust the parameters of the controllers online, specifically the K. So this can reduce the impacts of the attack, but does not eliminate it. I'm going to just show an example of how we did this on the load balancer. So this is with small k. The system behaves this way. This is on x-axis time. On y-axis, this is the admission ratio for one of the servers. So large k is bursty, but you can see here when the system is under attack, it's better to have large k because the system now becomes very responsive. However, when there is no attack, you better have small k because the system does not have these oscillations, which can cause underutilization. So this is what we get when we adjust the parameters of k online. This is so when we suspect that we're under attack, we increase the k. When we suspect that we're not under attack, we use smaller k. Yeah, sure.
Did you go back and calculate the worst case analytically for the third scenario?
Worst case here?
The worst case attack, the maximum potency attacker traffic, the third scenario?
With the K?
With the K adjusted online for the new control system.
I don't think I did compute it. Yeah, I didn't.
Okay.
Yeah. It's.
Guess why that would bother me though?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm not sure. Actually, I might have done that.
Okay.
Again, I'll get back to you on this. I can't remember. But this is definitely something that we should be looking at. Yeah. So I'm going to talk about RoQ exploits on network transfer protocols. So sure all of you know what transmission control protocol TCP. So it has two things. Its goals is to be greedy, try to acquire additional bandwidth, and at the same time, whenever there is congestion, it's tried to be fair, so it allows users to share the same path or the same resources in a friendly way. And they do additive increase, multiplicative decrease, so you increase your window size. Once you experience a loss, you decrease by half, and you do the same thing. So this would serve to utilize additional bandwidth, at the same time converge to fairness. There's also adaptation inside the network. So imagine you have some sender sending data packets. There's a buffer, which is the bottleneck link. And the receiver, when it gets the data packets, will send acknowledgements back to the server. And simple queue model is to use drop tail, simply drop a packet when the queue is full. There's a whole area of active queue management schemes where you can actually drop a packet early, even if you have a queue, even if you have an empty slot in the queue. And the idea here is that when you drop a packet early, you signal the sender to decrease its rate, and this stabilizes the queue. Like for example, red try to stabilize the queue to some target, and at the same time it desynchronizes the flows. So by dropping these, you don't punish a flow all the time. You try to distribute the packet loss across flows.
I don't think that's what desynchronizes flows means.
Desynchronized flows.
How did you explain it?
So if you have some packets, for example, from when you have a drop tail and packets come, you can drop multiple packets from the same connection, right?
Yes.
Multiple packets from all connections, from different connections.
Right.
So So basically, they all back off in the same time.
Yes, that's more.
Yes.
That's my understanding.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
I agree.
Okay. Maybe I said something wrong. I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay. So we use the dynamic fluid model. Again, we're modeling the same thing. Red adjusts the price or loss probability. TCP observes this loss probability and adjusts the rates. The rates and the attack traffic go to the buffering. The buffering reports back to the red controller, which adjusts the loss probability again. I will not go through the whole model, but again, we can simply describe these using fluid model equations. So these are the equations for random early drop and for the transmission control protocol TCP. So what I'm showing here is on the first row is the model, and on the second and third I'm showing simulations from using NS2. So this is the queue size over time. So at some point in time, the attack. So before the attack happens, the queue is stabilized at some value, and then the attacker would send these requests. So here I'm zooming into one of these bursts, so you can see that the queue jumps to its maximum of 250 packets, and then there's a period. Of course, this would cause losses for all flows. So all the flows will back off, causing underutilization of the link. And then once the queue size starts to stabilize again, this is where the attacker hits again. And what I'm showing here is actually the average throughput for all the connections. And in yellow is the average throughput for the attacker. So visually, you cannot distinguish the attack traffic from legitimate traffic. Again, this is with red, and this is with drop tail. Yeah.
Sorry, the last graph you said the individual vertical blue bars are the legitimate traffic?
Connections, per connection, yeah.
Okay, and then the yellow one is the attacker?
The attacker, yeah.
I see. So the point is you can't tell.
You cannot tell the difference.
Okay. Maybe we can try to ask a question here.
Sure.
So I've been trying to think about feasibility. It seems it's a common characteristic of the attacker that he's able to overwhelm some critical portion of the system, right? In this, it's the bottleneck.
Right.
In the previous examples, it's the back-end system. You'll push it into thrashing.
Correct.
I'm confused. What's the vertical scale on
here?
On the rightmost graph? Yeah. Does it say that the attacker can pull off this stuff without using any more bandwidth than a typical flow?
No, this is the average. This is taken over average. So remember the square wave?
Okay.
So I'm not looking at the instantaneous throughput during the attack. I'm looking at longer time scales.
Okay, so I guess my feasibility question is, how can we understand whether it's sort of feasible in practice or for a given system to generate a sufficiently intense...
Yeah, that's a very good question.
Like, suppose I'm trying to take down Amazon, right?
Yeah.
Like, I need to be able to generate so much instantaneous traffic
right.
that I actually push the entire frickin' system into thrashing.
That's correct, yeah.
Is that feasible for a small scale or medium scale attacker?
So yeah, so this will depend on the capacity of the system, how much capacity.
Or for the network buffering situation, right? I need to be able to single-handedly overrun the queue on whatever this network bottleneck is.
Right.
Right. So if I'm attacking some large-scale infrastructure, it seems like it might be daunting to generate.
It could be very hard. Yes, I agree with you. But in the same time, you might be using some of the legitimate traffic that's already been there, meaning that to cause this queue to exceed, you just need extra.
Okay, so
you don't need from the beginning.
It's already under heavy load.
Or
have to generate all the traffic.
Exactly.
I just have to be able to push it.
Exactly.
To overload.
Yes.
Okay. Well, so that seems promising because if the system is close to maximum utilization, I might be able to.
That's correct. Yeah.
Of course, any random monkey could walk up to it accidentally.
Yeah. So
it's being run too close to the red line.
it's actually in one of the papers we look at when is the best time to attack,
right.
Depending on should you attack when the buffer is empty, should you attack when the buffer is full.
So maybe a week before Christmas is the best time to attack Amazon. Running full tilt.
That's a good idea. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
So you're using this graph to say that you can't tell the attack traffic apart from the regular traffic.
That's correct.
With this measurement.
Based on average throughput.
Right.
But aren't there other ways, like can't I tell that the attacker's not backing off like he's supposed to, like everybody else is?
Oh, like UDP traffic? So this goes back to the difference between using... No, the attacker is using UDP. Sorry, I should have said this earlier. The attacker is using UDP traffic.
Does he have to use UDP?
I mean, he doesn't have to, but...
to get anything into this queue, right?
Yeah, but TCP will back off. He doesn't want to lose his packets.
Well, you could have a modified TCP. that-
Yeah, okay. Sure, so, yeah.
Suppose he
Yeah.
runs on numbers.
Yeah.
Well, it's very easy to modify.
Yeah.
But, I mean, if he's using EDP and everybody else is using TCP, then it's very easy to tell who the attacker is.
Okay, so he can use TCP forged packets like TCP, but he doesn't really abide to the AIMD. So
Right,
in this
is that
case,
still detectable that he's not?
It might be tricky to tell that he's not backing
That
up.
might be because you don't know
you're just the
what
network
packets
buffer,
he's
right?
dropping.
right? Yeah.
You could think he's the person who's getting lucky, right?
Yeah, you have to reason.
Especially in a
At the
red.
server level.
Especially in a red, if there's a red router in between, you can imagine someone's just getting lucky and all their packets are getting through just fine.
Or that there's further delay on the back end, right? And that he hasn't realized that
But
he's measured the pipe as being
couldn't-
extremely large.
Isn't though the fact that the yellow doesn't stand out because you're plotting average throughput rather than instantaneous?
That's right,
over
yeah.
time?
Yeah,
If you
Yeah,
just looked
because-
at who had the maximum,
That's right. Yeah.
doesn't that mean that the attacker would at least have to be doing a distributed denial of service attack rather than a single point denial of service attack? Because otherwise you
If he
could.
feared
Why?
being affected by transient.
Because otherwise, if you're looking at at very
Short time scales.
short time scales, he'd stand out still, right?
Yeah, if you look at short time scales, the attacker is going to be very high compared to the rest. But again, now you have to compute averages over very short time scale. This means that I can change, for example, my parameters and send UDP traffic all the time. So now I can. So if you tell me what threshold you're going to use, I'm going to try to come up with the best way to be not to be detected by your mechanism.
It also seems like not the sort of thing that you want to be doing in a network appliance, right?
Right.
Trying to track some large number of sending sources and figure out if they're sending high instantaneous load. It seems like a lot of silicon. You'd rather be using it for something else.
There's a question.
Yeah.
And actually, if we go back to your presentation, we can see that sometimes we measure the load looking at the number of connections, number of requests per second. However, the real load can be caused by the processing time of particular request. So we may just not see we may measure wrong cost. So for example, as there was an example with a hash table, when all the queries go in one bucket, but we may design, at the design time, we may decide, okay, we will see if somebody generates many queries per second, we will believe this is an attacker. However, in the reality, he or she can generate 5 queries, but those 5 queries may
very
become
hard.
very costly for us to process in the backend.
Yeah. Yeah, I just want to add something.
Using conjunction, right? If you know which attacks are, if you know which type of traffic is very expensive to process, that's useful traffic for achieving this effect, but you still need to send it first.
So actually, this is the question is about if we correctly measure the cost. Because usually we don't know. It's obvious to measure the cost in terms of delays of packets, throughput, number of queries. But the problems that were outlined in the very beginning, you should foresee that.
Yeah, you mean like,
Problem.
I see. So one thing about measuring, for example, what you said using the so the attacker can also send spoofed packets. So if you send spoofed packets, then you cannot really distinguish between what's really are the legitimate and which are. So even if you can detect that there is an attack going on, it's
Not with TCP though, right?
sorry.
Not with TCP. You can, if you're doing a TCP service, legitimately you have to be using real addresses, and you can tell false folks because they're not getting the responses back, so they can't.
Yeah, but now you're using a lot of, so the damage could be these extra complexity that you're going to have to add, and because you have to look at packets going in, packets going on the other way. So
No, I mean, the attacker cannot spoof TCP. If he's using TCP to attack, he has to use real addresses. And so if you don't need to take UDP packets, you can drop all UDP packets.
yeah, but this is at the so this is at the IP layer, right? This is a queue and this is a queue. It shouldn't be looking at TCP, and it shouldn't. So if you add this complexity, then
This is like a switch or something.
yeah, right. Yeah, this is a switch.
I could certainly imagine though people, if this was a big enough problem, at the internet attach point of some low bandwidth link, you would drop all UDP packets. Like I wouldn't be surprised if routers today already know how to do that. That's not terribly hard.
Right. Okay, so the damage is the wasted bandwidth. This is the period where the queue is empty, and the cost is the bandwidth of the attacker. So here we obtain results from NS around 8 or 10. So for every packet the attacker sends, 10 packets will be denied access.
Why is there
What's
such a
the mean in
difference in code?
Sorry?
So
Yeah.
the red model seems to vary quite a bit from the NS.
Right, yeah. So there's details that's been abstracted here. So for example, in the model, for example, we don't model timeout mechanisms, and we're using a fluid model. It's not really like doing the IMD, it's fluid. So that's why there's this difference in the potency.
So is NS measured?
NS, sorry?
Sorry, there's model and then there's NS, right?
Yeah,
NS is
network simulator. It's a network simulator.
numbers.
NS2, yeah. Yeah.
What are the absolute numbers for bandwidth?
So this is 467 packets per second,
Oh, packets per second.
and this is 56 packets per second.
Okay.
Yeah. And the link was 2,000 packets per second. So this is like 0.25.
So you're just assuming all packets are the same size?
Yeah, all packets are the same size, 1,000 bytes. Also, we can instantiate the damage as the variance in the queue size. This is for particular importance for streaming applications, for example. So, for example, and again, the cost would be the bandwidth. So you can see here that red. I'm sorry?
Sorry, I was just struck by how much smaller now the potency numbers are, right?
Yeah, because here I'm measuring the difference is variance. Now it's variance divided by bandwidth.
Okay.
They are not the same units.
It's variance in milliseconds divided by
Bandwidth
in packets.
packets. Yeah. Yeah, it's a measure of
Right.
how much variance you cause by how much traffic you send.
Right.
So red in particular, before the attack is trying to stabilize the queue. So it has a low variance here. But after attack, it's higher variance. It's compared to drop tail. So this means that red becomes actually as a drop tail. Doesn't try to do anything. Okay, so this is the implementation setup I used. We had 2 servers. This server was somewhere in Italy to measure longer round trip time, and this server was in the lab. And we had a bunch of clients generating requests to these servers. Servers would reply with files, and the attacker would send requests along this way. And we created here a bottleneck of 10 megabits per second. So this would be our bottleneck link. Sorry?
So these are the legitimate clients arrayed on the left.
Right.
But the attacker isn't in that part of the topology.
Yeah, the data packets are going this way, so the attack traffic will going this way as well.
Okay.
And we use some attack sync just for the attack traffic to go there, but it could use any one of these.
So the attacker is attacking the reply traffic, not the request traffic.
Yes, because the data is coming this way.
So the requests are lightweight, the responses are heavyweight. So the attacker is trying to disrupt the flow of
The data. That's right, yeah.
Okay. And why can't he attack the response data by being somewhere else in the topology?
Why it could be somewhere else?
Yeah, why exactly can't he be over by the clients? Because he's going to try to overwhelm these switches, right?
This is the attack source, right? This is the guy who's sending packets.
I understand. I'm just wondering why he isn't in the same spot as the clients. So his objective is to try to overwhelm either one of these 2 switches that the response traffic.
No, here, this switch with 10 megabits per second.
That switch specifically.
Yeah, this is the bottleneck, yeah.
Okay.
So you're saying why this is not on the other side?
Yeah.
Oh, you can think about this guy attached to the internet.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is, what I'm showing here is the effect of changing parameters on the potency. For example, here I'm changing tau, the duration of the attack, and this is the potency. And you can see that when tau is very small, the potency is very low, and then you reach a point where you maximize, and once you start increasing again, the cost starts kicking in and you have lower potency. Here I'm showing the effect of the period, the idle period. So once you increase the idle period, you get to this diminishing return, which means that for every burst you send, the damage is a constant. And when tau is very small or 0, this is exactly like DOS attack, where you flood all the time. So you have a potency of 0 almost. You don't, the cost is very huge. Yes?
Why doesn't potency drop off?
Here?
Increase the inter-attack period.
Yeah, because the damage per burst is a constant. So whether you do it more often or
Total damage over time. So just
damage over time.
Your ability to inflict damage.
Right.
Okay.
They are the same, because if you're going to repeat it every time, you're going to have the same potency every time.
Yeah, but
So on average, it's the
if
same.
there were a different graph, like total damage I have caused.
Yeah, they will be different.
Then you're interested. So I mean, if you're trying to
So
if you're trying to inflict the maximum.
you should operate here.
Yeah, you're interested.
Exactly. Yes.
So
Yeah.
how does you have sort of omnipotent knowledge here. How would an attacker determine what that would be?
That's a very good question. So you can think of attacker sending probe requests to measure, for example, round trip time. And once the round trip time stabilizes or the variance is very low, then the system has recovered, and this is the right time to attack again.
So you can measure this from the outside. I mean, after all, the thing that you're trying to disrupt is something that's observable to
Right.
regular
Exactly.
clients.
Yes.
Tend to be a regular client.
Right. Okay. So.
But getting back to Mark's question before,
Mhm.
it seems rather difficult for an attacker to actually insert themselves in a spot where they're sending from behind a low bandwidth link, right? Usually you only see the low bandwidth links at the edges of the
Right.
network. And that would require if you want to attack the data stream coming out of one of those, the attacker has to basically be inside.
That's
the site.
correct. Yeah.
So
Yeah. So.
it's really a real concern.
It's really finding at least one service inside the site that will take your traffic. Like, it could be a blog post, right?
I think it's a different question.
We're looking at, right?
You actually have to be able to
disrupting.
generate traffic from inside the site.
We're talking about different cases, right? Like
Yeah, these are two different questions.
So I've understood this case correctly. The attack is to overwhelm the last hop to a family of clients, right? So to do that, you have to be able to target traffic at that low bandwidth
Correct.
bottleneck.
Yes.
Right? I assume there are other kinds of attacks. I mean, we've talked about other attacks before, right? Where you try to overwhelm the backend. That's different, right?
I see.
Yeah.
Or suppose you could generate enough traffic to overwhelm some further upstream
So,
link, which
so
might
you
not be
could use
feasible,
this
right?
to
could knock
attack.
out
You could
Seattle,
use this to
right?
attack an ISP that you particularly don't like.
If you could get it to
small
sync traffic
ISP.
for you, yeah, you could try to
Yeah.
take down its link, right? You
Right.
take down,
Yeah.
Quest's customers.
Well, all you need is one client. You just sign up for the ISP and then you kill it.
That's right. Yeah.
It's all about what resource you choose to attack, right? You can attack the back end of the service, you can attack a low bandwidth link, you can attack, some shallow buffer router.
And this also could be done in a distributed way. So even if as an attacker, if I don't have enough bandwidths that I can, send these square waves, then I can have somebody who can send again this wave, and maybe by doing the right timing, we can cause them to overlap. But again, maybe you have to increase by tau a little bit so that you can guarantee the overlap. Okay. So RoQ Attacks, they reduced the bandwidth here from 8.8 to 3.6 with 100.37 megabits per second, potency of 12. This is different from, so there is a RoQ Attacks which target TCP timeout, and the idea is that you choose your T to be always 1 second because this is the TCP timeout mechanism. So this is the potency from RoQ Attack. The potency is 4.3. This is like almost 3 times as much damage as the RoQ Attacks. So it's very challenging because these RoQ Attacks could be mounted in a distributed way, and also searching for this optimal point can be done by an attack controller, changing the parameters until he reaches this point. Also, sources and destinations could be spoofed, since here we're attacking a link. As long as you know that a destination, particular IP destination, will be routed through this link, you can use it. Okay, so I'm just going to end up. So the conceptual contribution of this work is that we showed that actually throwing adaptation at a problem is a problem. A lot of work has been done in adaptation mechanisms. However, the proper attention to the security implications has not been considered. We introduced this new notion of potency. We're not just talking about damage, we're talking about damage divided by cost. We're accounting for the cost of the attack. And we should design trade-offs between being resilient to RoQ attacks and being vulnerable. And it's clear that sometimes going the last mile by doing these tweaks is not worth it because it makes the system vulnerable. So the result is a framework for studying dynamic exploits. I've showed these vulnerabilities on common system that we use today, and we quantified the potency on each setting. So this work has triggered some work on 3 different aspects. So people start looking at other vulnerabilities. For example, there's work in Purdue looking at exploiting the adaptation of attackers. In end system multicast, you have a tree. So what happens if the attacker exploits these adaptation by placing himself somewhere in this tree? Also, some people looked at accounting and assessing the dynamic exploits. And there's work that's been done on defending RoQ exploits. So this is just a part of a bigger picture. What I'm showing here is some taxonomy of my work. So there's work on end system, work on networks. There's some adversarial work and non-adversarial work. What I'm showing in gray is the parts where I did model and evaluation, and here I did system building and prototype testing. I'd be happy to talk about any of these during the interview today. Since I'm running out of time,
It's okay.
yeah.
We can keep going, right?
I think we should stop here.
Okay, whatever you want.
All right. So thanks all, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
I'll save mine for lunch.
Sure.
On the TCP attack that you were doing
Yeah.
for the bandwidth link,
Mhm.
what was the other traffic? I mean, what was the other traffic being attacked?
Was FTP connections?
It was continuous.
Continuous,
coming in,
yeah, FTP.
connection.
Yeah.
So, if the majority of the traffic on the internet today is actually web services,
Mhm.
in terms of actual connections, not bandwidth. My understanding is that most web connections are actually so short that TCP rarely goes into backing off on anything because there's just not enough data, right?
Right.
And never gets out of slow start. Would those? I wouldn't see it. It wouldn't seem to me that the majority of the actual web traffic would be affected by this. It's only the ones that were hit during the TAO, right? So you would still only really be affecting a small subset of the traffic.
You're saying that the big
Right,
damage
so-
that comes from overrunning a network link is that you cause TCP sessions to back off.
Yeah.
That's right. That's
What if they never do?
yeah. So
you're basically only attacking the users that essentially hog the link. You're attacking the FTP connections and probably today the BitTorrent connections.
Well, for this sort of attack to succeed, right, there has to be this sort of rippling damage effect, right, where there's a backoff, or there's a protective
Yes.
shutdown, or a gate closes, or people give
Right.
up.
So
right.
RoQ Attacks,
So what I'm saying
they
is I'm talking particularly about the low bandwidth link and the TCP connection.
Yeah.
It seems that the only way to really take down that link is to completely flood it because
No.
short
Short periods. Oh,
connections
sure.
will
Okay.
get through just fine as long as they don't happen to coincide with your short burst attacks, right?
So short connections, they don't have these adaptation, right? The IMD
Right,
is not
right.
there.
Yeah. So they
So
don't-
RoQ Attacks only,
They can't affect them.
yes, yes.
So that was
Because there's no adaptation here.
And in fact, it almost seems to me that the intellectual property owners of the world might actually start wanting to attack ISPs this way because the normal things the people who would be getting hurt the most are the BitTorrent users and the people doing large data transfers, right? And whereas web traffic people would hardly be affected at all.
Okay, so
you could almost see this as being a shake up.
yeah, let me show you one more slide, which actually it's interesting because it relates to what you said.
You're saying only, you're sort of saying only long-standing resource usage patterns have these sort of back-off characteristics. So if
Right.
you don't like those people, you can easily
Right.
disrupt their backup.
Actually-
by pulsing the availability of the network.
Exactly.
Anyone who doesn't have that sort of long-term usage won't be
Yeah.
affected.
Right.
So actually, this is exactly what I used in a different work where, so imagine now that Alice and Bob are using this link, and here is a bottleneck using this yellow flow. So they are not happy with their share here. So they call some attacker, and the attacker has some zombies, and the attacker is going to attack the blue flows on different links, on EB and CF. So the bandwidth on BC will be acquired eventually by Alice and Bob.
How do the attackers ensure that they're taking down only the blue flows?
Yeah, so this is, yeah, they use like trace route and they exchange information.
So here they would attack EB?
Right, so EB and CF, if they can
Right.
recognize them.
Okay. And Alice and Bob get
So this can be used, for example, of what you said.
No, it's somewhat different than what I was getting at. But,
It's close.
well, no, I was getting at what if Alice and Bob are actually sending a movie across that link, whereas other people are using the BC link just to do regular web traffic.
Or the reverse, right? Alice and
Right.
Bob use
The blue.
short-lived HTTP connections, and blue is FTP, right? So now you mount an attack against the BC link, right? You don't care. But Alice and Bob's short-lived sessions are invulnerable, right? And it knocks out the blue flows because they use FTP, and then Alice and Bob are happy.
Yes. So actually, this technique is used for stealing bandwidth. If Alice and Bob want to steal bandwidth, then they can do that.
Thank you, Mina.
Thank you.